All right, we're now live for the first philosophy pop-up of the month of September. It's on September 11th. So I thought that a fitting topic for this one might be to talk about national security and terrorism and how we might look at those sorts of things using perspectives coming from ethics, which often I think gets left out of the picture, even though there's a lot of moral language used with respect to those things. I don't have a big agenda in mind. I thought that I would see where the audience is on these things and do a lot of back and forth responses. But I will say this, we were talking about this earlier today. Those of us who have been around for quite a while and remember where we were on September 11th and what happened, as we're going through and don't know what's actually occurring. I remember that my response at first, when my sister called me and said, "Hey, you got to turn on the TV," was to think, well, they attacked it once before. I remember that happening while I was in college, and thinking to myself how easy it would be to do things like that in the various buildings that we had here in Milwaukee. I remember talking with some of the other security guards about just how lax security really was. And when it comes down to it, it's quite difficult to harden targets to the point where they can't be readily affected. And that is one of the major changes that we've seen here in the United States in the last almost 2 decades since 9/11. We're now getting close to the 20-year mark, and we've seen this vast proliferation of all sorts of different security apparatus, and some of them are quite effective and others are not. And I think one of the things that you could actually talk about from a moral or ethical perspective is there an imperative to make sure that if you're going to start implementing new measures, and there are definitely things that are going to fall upon many people who are not in any way culpable, that there's some sort of payoff, some sort of reliable payoff to it, and you're not just doing, as we call it, security theater. Which I think has been a big problem here in the United States and in the past. Not seeing any chat stuff yet. I'm going to make sure that it's actually working. So let me say hello to everyone. But yeah, so there's a number of different topics. I think another thing that we have to consider is the cost involved in these measures. The cost, not just in terms of monetary cost, but in terms of all the other resources that we end up having to throw into national security and preventing terrorism. The other thing that I think that we often leave out too is it's terrorism if it's a readily identifiable enemy, but we often don't call many things terrorism that, strictly speaking, we ought to be. And if we did, then we would have to follow an important guideline in ethics or critical thinking or reasoning in general, which is to treat similar cases similarly, to say that, if we're going to say that certain things are off limits for our enemies to do, then we should also start thinking that those things are off limits for us and start thinking about the cost of going along with them. We should, acknowledge that our policy has been, in many cases, whether we like it or not, to induce terror in populations to produce compliance from them. So we have a few questions here which are, I think, similar questions from Baka Josian and Per Obaizatian. A lot of tough names to pronounce here. Do I think torture is completely indefensible? Is there ever a situation when torture is acceptable? I mean, I tend to take a fairly utilitarian line when it comes to the use of force and even torture. But the question that we have to ask is so the utilitarian line would say that, yeah, in some cases it's going to be acceptable. But it has to be for some greater good, and it has to be an identifiable greater good. And I'm not sure that that's the case in many of the situations where we do it. The question about the ticking time bomb scenario, that's sort of like a special case of that. It's much more clear where you say, well, this person has information about the time bomb that's going to go off. Do you torture them? Do you use duress in other ways? I mean, you can ask the same thing about lying to them. You can ask the same thing about other things that we see as moral or ethical violations. Are those then acceptable? And one thing to keep in mind that I think often gets left out is it's never saying that it becomes a good thing to do in those circumstances or the right thing to do. It's just less bad, right? It's just less unjustified than it would be in other cases. There shouldn't be a normalization of violence or torture or these other things that we see as, threats to the integrity of the person and general acknowledged human rights. And I know some of my audience out there will say human rights, they don't exist or they're a figment or something like that. They may well be, but you sure as hell want other people to be recognizing them, and we often appeal to them rather inconsistently. Molly Boy has an interesting comment here. It always boggled my mind as a foreigner how the USA spends so much money on warfare when people are homeless or that money could be used in other needs. How is that humanly moral or good thinking? And quite honestly, the answer is it's not. We do spend far too much of our resources on the, not just the defense complex, but all the other things that are associated with it. And we do so in part because you might say it outsources the casualties to other people. There's this notion that, well, better to fight them over there than over here. And that's been a prevalent part of our strategy. We also have another part of our strategy that we've been doing for a long time, which is to substitute, technological solutions for human problems. And so, we have these incredibly advanced weaponry systems that can boost force capabilities, but they're incredibly devastating to the people who we run across. So you look at, Iraq and the damage that we did to it, not just in the latest war, but in the first Iraq war, where we had very few casualties, but inflicted, massive casualties on these poor bastards who are stuck out there conscripted, getting bombed, by us. And so we've got that part of it. And we do spend an extraordinary amount of money and resources just on military preparedness, not to mention the extension of U.S. force all over the place. And you can say, well, if we didn't do that, if we didn't preserve a sort of stable world order that was, you could say, for the time being at least, American-led, right, where we are the hyperpower, to use the term that got coined in the 90s, which I don't think is a status that we're going to retain, all that long, because this is not sustainable. But you could say, well, better us than the Russians or the Chinese, or pick whoever else. And there may be something to that, or some, just chaos. You could say that there's some, some argument to be made there, but you could also say, well, why shouldn't we be preparing for a global order where we don't actually run the show and we have to argue with people and try to, cajole them into, say, protecting human rights or preventing genocide or things like that. If it's really just a matter of if it's not us, it's going to be somebody worse than us, then I think we're screwed, because we're not going to stay on top all that long. Probably not my entire lifetime, and I have maybe hopefully another 40 years to go. So, why are we spending so much? I mean, you could point to all sorts of vested interests, as a lot of people do, and say, well, there's a whole industry that we're supporting and it produces jobs. But that money could be spent on so many other better things. I think when we look at other countries and we say, well, national health care is something that most first world countries are able to afford. It is something that we could afford if we wanted to fix things and fix them in a sort of permanent way rather than just, tweaking things here and there. But it's just not seen as a major priority by the public and the politicians in the way that it should be. It's seen by part of them as a major priority, but even then they don't get it right. I mean, we're on Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, and it's sometimes very difficult to get to actually use the insurance that you pay for in the marketplace. It requires jumping through so many hoops. And you talk to Democratic candidates and you're like, what are you going to do to try to fix this? And they're like, the Republicans are going to take it away. And you're like, yeah, I already got that. What are you going to do to make it possible for ordinary people to use these benefits that you got them? And there's no answer. So we don't really have the political will, unfortunately, to do much about it. All right, there's a lot of stuff here people are asking about. Dark Star, there's a practice in information security called hacking back, where an organization attacks its enemies as retribution or to ward off further attacks. Is this ethical in your opinion? Kind of depends on the nature of the organization to begin with, right? So we're talking about, say, a criminal organization which is, attacking its opponents preemptively or just as retribution for attacking them after, say, they were trying to steal information or something like that. I don't think there's much of a case to be made there that's particularly ethical. But what about, we could talk about, again, what about our national security state? If we're constantly getting probed, as we are, quite honestly, by China. I mean, China has been interested in cyber attacks for 20 years. There's documents out there where they were like, well, there's this form of warfare, this form of warfare, this form of warfare, and we should do this against the Americans for a long time. And the Russians have. So if we're pushing back against that, is that justified? Yeah, I'd say it is. But we do have to think about what the human cost is. Is there spillover to ordinary people in their lives? Or we could, interesting. Think about like a huge organization like, say, Google or Amazon or Apple or any of those. If they're Facebook, if they're coming under attack, should they, are they sort of legitimized to go on the attack themselves? And we might say, well, yeah, sure. But then what if they start saying, well, I think that this is going to be preemptively, this is a strategy for preempting potential malefactors. Then it starts to get a lot more dicey, doesn't it? Friedrich Garipi, is it progress if we bargain with ethics? Maybe Friedrich, who asked this question before in another one, I don't know what bargain with ethics means. So you got to rephrase that in a way that I can answer it, because I just have no conception of what that possibly means. Charles Baudelaire, I see what you did there with that name. You're streaming simultaneously with Rick Beato, YouTube's best music channel. It's a sin. I have no idea who Rick Beato is. If he's not doing classic metal, I probably won't care. I mean, if you said that I was streaming at the same time as, Iron Maiden or Raven or Algie Ward's Tank or something like that, okay, maybe then I'd say, okay, I should put it on hold for a bit. But I don't have any idea who this is. All right, more stuff. More from Baka Jisan. Do I think being able to own a gun, regardless of who you are, is a staple of American national identity, that citizens should be armed? That's a good question. So we definitely have what researchers call a gun culture here, right? And that definitely does seem to have a long-standing basis in our culture early on. But the notion of having high power weaponry, where you can, even on semi-auto, you can pump out a lot of rounds, you can reload very quickly. I would say that's, this is one of the things where we Americans were kind of divided, right? And I have a lot of family who are very, very big on guns. Many of them are, I would say, quite, responsible gun owners. Some of them not quite so much. And I have quite a few family members who don't have guns, and I don't have a gun myself, although I don't have any objection to owning small numbers. If you have more than 3 or 4 guns, unless you're a hunting guide or something like that, man, I don't want to hear about it. It's not you could have other sorts of hobbies other than investing in hardware like that. So I don't have much sympathy with that at all. Is it part of the American identity? That's sort of what's at stake. There's a lot of people for whom it really is part of their identity. And you could say, well, if it's part of their identity, then you have to let them do what they want. Sort of. I mean, for some people, smoking meth is part of their identity too. We don't say that's a-okay, and I'm not saying they're exactly on the same level, but you can't just say, well, it's part of my identity, so therefore I get to do whatever I want. I think that this is something that we should have a real conversation about, and I would love to see the people who muddy the waters on this, namely the people who are making money either by promoting or by attacking guns, get the hell out of the conversation so the rest of us could actually participate in it. That's not going to happen, unfortunately. But so, we have to decide what we're going to do instead. And it's very difficult to do much about it here in the United States as opposed to other countries. But, it is something that we ought to do something about. And I don't think that I mean, if your identity is wrapped up in owning guns, you're badly off. You got problems. There's so many other better things to have your identity wrapped up in. Aldous Huxley, do I think deontological ethics can apply in international value judgments about culture, etc.? Can we save objective ethics from the charge of being neo-colonial or Eurocentric? That's a good question. So we have to think about what it means to save something from the charge. Does that mean that nobody can, we get ourselves to the point where nobody can make the charge? No, because you can always be attacked by somebody who wants to say you're doing the wrong thing, you're an aggressor, you're a neo-colonialist, you're a this or that, right? You will always have, especially in the internet age, you will always have some detractors, right? The question is whether they're legitimate in saying that, and that's a different question. Deontological ethics. So when we're saying deontological ethics, we're talking about a family of approaches. And let's strip away some that are going to be non-starters to begin with, because divine command theory can be understood as a form of deontological ethics, but that's not really going to fly as you're trying to apply it to multiple people in multiple cultures who may not, in fact, accept whatever divine command you're working with. What about, like, say, Kantian ethics, or W.D. Ross's and Robert Audi's intuitionist ethics? Okay, they're a better prospect, right? Duty-based, rule-based ethics is what we're talking about. You could say that the focus on respecting rights can be understood as a deontological ethics as well. So if you're saying, we have to respect human rights as defined, say, in the United Nations Declaration, or if we take particular countries' notions of human rights, okay, that could be deontological as well. And you are going to find people, anytime that you try to apply that, like, let's say you say, you can't, keep women out of educational opportunities and institutions. And somebody's like, well, my culture, women in my culture have to be subservient, and that's the way we've always been. You can say, well, no, that's not going to work anymore. We're not going to go along with that. We're actually going to put some teeth in it. We're going to withdraw funding from you, or we're going to, step in and do something. Are you then being neo-colonial or Eurocentric? They're going to charge you for being so, but I think it can be done in ways that aren't neo-colonial, because if things really, if there really are universal human values and say, human rights and stuff like that, they're not going to be just a matter of the white European coming in and imposing them. They're going to be recognized by other people, and that seems to be where things are going. Perobization. Thoughts on the ethics of drone strikes? Well, drone strikes, that I was saying that we here in America often don't make, we don't include some of the things that we do as terrorism, but people, in other places looking at it, say this is pretty, terrorist, like you're terrorizing us. And I think a lot of drone strikes, the way that they've been used, has been doing that. When we accept collateral damage on a large scale, then that's a real problem. And the idea of using drones rather than human beings, there's something, sort of putting them up in the sky and you never know when they're coming in. It's clear that part of the intent is to coerce a population into doing things the way that we want them done. I think that I'm not going to say that, nobody should ever use drones, but we really need a lot more oversight on how we're doing it, and this applies to both administrations. Well, all three administrations who are using them: Bush, Obama, Trump. It's not a Democrat versus Republican issue. They've both been pretty equally bad on this sort of thing. The other thing to keep in mind too, whenever it comes to like Americans and our advanced military technology, we should always think, man, how are we going to like it when they start doing this to us? Because sooner or later, everything that we do develop can be turned against us. If we think that it's okay to inflict it on other people, then, we should think about whether that's equally okay when it's done sooner or later to us. And we're always like, no, that's terrible. The craven enemy with their cowardly ways. Well, how is it any different if we do it? And we're the ones who actually have some measure of control. Of course, most of us have zero control about what the national security apparatus does or what the military decides to do, right? But we can at least say we're not for it. Here's a really interesting question from Xana Scarlett. Do I personally believe terrorism is the new face of conventional warfare that other higher forces like the USA or others use as alternative? You believe in conspiracy. So, oh, I see. So if we're talking about in terms of terror, conspiracy, right? The U.S. would be, say, sponsoring terrorism, which goes against the U.S., which then we can respond to and say we're going to topple this regime or something like that. I don't know, quite frankly. That could be the case. I'm not saying it is, because I don't have evidence to say that that's the case. And I think that before we say something like that really is going on, we probably want to have evidence. I think in a lot of cases the explanation is closer to the ground. I don't think there's some vast national security conspiracy to produce terrorism so that then we can use it as an excuse for national security. I think we have like lots and lots of different actors, many of whom are poorly developed morally and intellectually, and it includes many of our own people acting in the military and in the national security state and in our leadership, who then respond, and there's a lot of back and forth. The thing with terrorism is it begets more terrorism in general. And is it the new face of conventional warfare? Yeah, you resort to terrorism when you can't fight the enemy on their own grounds. I mean, this is what, guerrilla warfare is not new. That goes all the way back centuries and actually millennia. They were doing that to the Romans in Spain, when and in other places as well. Well, and also, think about the Zealots in ancient Judea. And terrorism has been around for a long time too. The notion, think about what terrorism is. you're using force in such a way that you attack targets so as to, disrupt that society by inducing terror, producing the idea that you never know where the blow is going to fall. So people have been engaging in this for a long time. I think here in America, there was a sense before 9/11 that we were rather insulated from it, that most of the rest of the world didn't enjoy, right? And so when 9/11 happened, I know this actually pisses some people off because they're so emotionally invested in it, from time to time. I was like, well, it happened here because it happens everywhere else. And, it's not a big surprise that sooner or later something like that would get pulled off. And we're not immune. We're not exceptional in that way, except in the fact that we do push most of it off on other people. So. All right, Ardo Gimel, the right wing runs this country, i.e. supremacy dominates, the left has little power. I'd say, most of the right has little power too. The left and the right are not monolithic things. They're coalitions of groups. And I think in many respects, many of the people who run the show are perfectly happy to be on right or left. They don't really care. They may tie in with particular things that we identify with right-wing ideology at the present or left-wing ideology at the present. But, you take the longer historical view and, let's take the gun thing, right? The NRA used to actually be for gun control. Now they're against it because there was a massive shift. And it's not just a right-wing shift, right? You could call it sort of we probably need a better spectrum than just right-left, right, for identifying these sorts of things. And I don't think that the two, variable thing of right-left and authoritarian-libertarian works very well either for categorizing things. Things are a lot more complicated than that. But I will say this about, the elites or what you're calling supremacy. We have a political class. We have a lot of people who made it in, and they make tons of money off of their participation in politics, and their kids don't go to the same schools as we do, and they don't live the same kind of life and face the same kind of challenges that the rest of us do. They may have come from places where originally they did, like Clinton from a trailer park, or the way Obama grew up, but they're not part of us. Well, any of these people who've managed to make it up into these tiers, they aren't with the rest of us, whether we're on the left or the right. And they, for the most part, they're circulating everything within their own group. So, all right, Charles Baudelaire, will war as the major cultural narrative of nations ever get replaced? Or is it inherent to the concept of the national state? It's a great question, isn't it? What else could take its place? That's the key way of responding to that. Actually, there's two things. What could take its place? Is there something that can mobilize people as much as making war? And then what do you do about the other countries if you become, more enlightened and find some other great project to engage in? What do you do about the other countries who haven't gotten the memo and are like, no, we want to take you over. We want to be the hegemon. That's a little bit harder to deal with, right? But are there countries that have managed to find a national narrative that works for them better? Countries that at one time were quite warlike? I think so. Think about the Scandinavian countries, right? You may not, love the way that their social welfare state turned out, but they're pretty invested in that and in equality. They are struggling quite a bit right now with the issue of what do you do with waves of immigration coming in with people that don't share those values, which is really one of the major questions for Europe and for America and for many other places as well, including China, by the way. It's not immigration in China. It's more about what do you do with ethnic nationalities who don't fit in to the Han Chinese Communist Party dominated way of doing things. But yeah, you can have all sorts of other prospects. But what do you do about the fact that you're going to have the others, the barbarians at the gates that you have to deal with? Good question. Even, and if you think about it, even like the sci-fi shows that we have, like think about Star Trek, right? Star Trek is supposed to have this post-scarcity universe, the Federation. You got people from everywhere, you know, and all sorts of backgrounds. Well, they're still perpetually at war, though. You know, if it's not the Klingons, it's the Romulans. If it's not the Romulans, it's, you know, this group or that group. And much of the narrative still centers around that. Or you know, in the shows, it centers around interpersonal relationships. You know, is you know, this person going to sleep with that person, and how are they going to take it? You know, or somebody gets a disease and then they have to solve that. But a lot of it, you know, it is difficult to get away from. But there are other things that could substitute for that. All right, Boblin or Levick, sum up Hegel in 3 sentences. You know that's impossible. Thesis, antithesis, synthesis. Yeah. Anybody who knows Hegel knows that thesis, antithesis, synthesis isn't really Hegel. But, you know, that's what people put out there. John Fisher Quire. So this is a little bit different. Views on decriminalization of recreational drug use. I think punishing people for using drugs recreationally is unjust. So I would say, you know, personally, I am in favor of decriminalizing drug use of certain drugs, and then not necessarily of everyone. I mean, I'm not going to say, yeah, smoke as much meth as you want, or shoot up as much heroin as you want, because people who do those, there isn't any like just the right amount of meth, you know, to keep yourself going. Pot, you know, very different story. Maybe some of the other things, you know, if you think about ecstasy, could be used in the right amounts. Psychedelics maybe aren't going to be as bad as people have made them out to be. And perhaps if it's done under controlled circumstances, there'd be a lot less problems coming up, and, you know, quality control issues. That said, right now, you know, we've got a real problem when it comes to this sort of thing, because we have these massive criminal networks that are how much of this stuff gets to us. So what do we do with that? And think about this. Those are bad enough. And then what's the alternative? Is it you know, all small business? No, it's going to be massive business growing these things and distributing them. That could be a problem as well. But yeah, in general, when it comes to recreational use of drugs, I mean, I think there have to be some limits on it. Don't you know, say, well, hey kids, you know, 12 years old, here's your kit, try them all out, or something like that. You know, like when I was in health class, we always had, like, every time that we took health class, we had to have a whole section on different kinds of drugs. And by the way, it turns out that these sections are terrible for preventing drug use, because kids find out, oh, well, you can smoke pot and get this sort of effect, and you can, like, you know, do this and get this kind of effect. Back when I was a kid, of course, it was pot and drinking and barbiturates that were the really big worries at the time. Well, that and acid. But, you know, you're not going to say, hey, anybody should do whatever the hell they want. But should we loosen the restrictions? Should we get rid of these draconian drug laws that put people in prison for 20 years for very small amounts of drugs? Yeah, I think so. And I think so. We probably should do that on the basis of sort of, you know, racial equity, you know, because the burden of these things have fallen very, very heavily on minority communities here in the United States. And I imagine it's probably similar in other places as well. So, all right. Holodomor, you take a pragmatic standpoint saying the end justifies the means. Where did Kant fall in that regard? Is Kant still useful today as his formalism or rationalism of this vein outlived itself? Kant thought that you know, ends can justify means too. It's just a question of which ends, right? So this whole thing of saying the ends justify the means, every ethicist thinks that some ends justify some means. I wouldn't call what I take a pragmatic standpoint, because I'm not a pragmatist. I went to school with a bunch of pragmatists. I would say that, you know, the stance that I take is probably best understood as sort of a overall virtue ethics standpoint, which incorporates some aspects of deontology and utilitarianism and even ethics of care within it. Where did Kant fall in that? I mean, you can if you want to see what Kant said about politics, there's really two main places to go. You've got these essays like on perpetual peace, and those are good to read. But there's also the metaphysical elements of justice. There's the groundwork to the metaphysics of morals. The actual metaphysics of morals is the metaphysical elements of virtue and the metaphysical elements of justice. And there Kant is laying out his view of social policy. And Kant is willing to say have capital punishment or things along those lines. He's not doing so on like utilitarian grounds, but it's rather, the person is like violated their place in the community. They should actually realize that they need to be executed in that case. So has formalism of Kant's sort outlived itself? I think it's always going to be useful as a touchstone. I mean, I think it's best to understand deontology as sort of a set of guide rails that we need in place. I think it can be useful in that respect. Molly, boy, do I think World War III will ever happen? I hope to God not. If you do think so, do you agree it will wipe out humanity? Or do you think, as Eisenhower said, nuclear weapons will cancel out war? Boy, I would hate to see any more nuclear weapons being used. And I'd hate to see other things being used as well. We are living in some very dangerous times, not least, I mean, there's danger because of, terrorism. What if a terrorist organization gets a small nuclear device? Okay, that's true, right? But also because of, countries fighting with each other. But we also live in very dangerous times because, global climate change is taking place. I mean, the Rand Corporation, the military, they all know it's not bullshit. They all know that these pipe dreams that people have of, oh, it's not really happening. The science is there's no real consensus. They all know that's all bullshit. It is happening. I mean, hell, I can look around here in Wisconsin and see that non-native species have moved up from Illinois because it's getting hotter here. There's no snow on the ground like there used to be when I was a kid, staying over the time. And that is really affecting things across the world. It's changing, where water is available and how hot the summers are, how much electricity is needed in order to ensure not just human comfort, but sometimes human life. That's going to destabilize an awful lot of stuff. We also have, disease-resistant, not disease-resistant, we have antibiotic and antiviral-resistant bugs coming out that could turn into a pandemic. I mean, we don't need World War III for things to become completely screwed up. We're so dependent upon our logistics and, other electronically based networks. What if those go down? What if they go down precisely because we have a pandemic and we can't maintain them? We're screwed then. Really, really screwed. So we could be in a lot of trouble even without World War III. All right. CC, war is the result of appreciating cultural differences. I suppose if the cultural differences are something like they're going to kill us and the only way we can protect ourselves is killing them, you could say that's the case, but I don't know about that. All right. TJ Bonnet, the violence in Yemen seems pertinent if it is justified in terms of national security, yet manifests as terrorism to civilians, and any sense of ethical justification or constitution is missing. I don't think it's justified in terms of national security, and I mean, there's the part of the problem is we're not the only actors there. Of course, the Saudis and the Iranians have gotten mixed up in it as well. I mean, that's the sort of thing where probably the UN should be having peacekeepers on the ground. That's one of the problems with the UN is they're often where they shouldn't be and often not where they should be. But it is terrorism that what goes on there quite often. Slow-mo, is there such a thing as a just war in your opinion? Yeah, there's just wars, and you can also prosecute an unjust war in the part of it that you're doing justly, and you can also prosecute a just war unjustly. And a war can be just in some respects and unjust in others. I don't think it's like an off-on switch. And I think it's important that before we get involved in wars, we have these conversations. I'd love to see politicians and decision makers getting a robust education in some sort of just war theory, and then when they make the case, having to make a real case about it. But you also have to deal with all the heel draggers who, no matter what you do, are going to say, no, you should do more diplomacy, give it more of a chance, because that's a perennial thing as well. But yeah, I think there's just wars. They're probably a lot fewer than we think, right? LB, I'm taking an anthropology course this fall. I wonder what your thoughts are on cultural relativity in general, as how it might affect ethical issues such as female genital mutilation. Well, I mean, so we know that there's cultural relativity. That's a fact about cultures. Whether they're justified in maintaining that, or whether we should all be relativists in a prescriptive sense and say, oh, gotta respect everybody's cultures and stuff like that. That's a whole different ball game. The one doesn't necessarily lead to the other, although a lot of anthropologists push that line pretty hard, don't they? A lot of the time that people are relativists, you got to ask, what are you getting out of it? Are you being the cool, enlightened Westerner who gets to tell all the other Westerners how to behave, and line themselves up with the other people and make themselves feel okay? Are you doing it because you like to, stir stuff up? Some people are relativists. Sometimes you hear relativist lines from people who are about to exploit you. And some people are relativists because they want to continue within their own culture all sorts of exploitative or dominating practices. And I'd say female genital mutilation is one of them. That should end. I mean, if you want to have a continuance of it, let women turn 18 and then decide if they want to, have parts removed, right? As we do let people do. But to inflict that on children, I think that's wrong. All right, TK, I know you don't think much of Sam Harris, but I think his attempts to direct us towards objective ethical assessments is a good and even valid cause. The reduction of suffering as conscious beings as ethics require there be conscious creatures who can suffer even exist. I just had to think with your previous comment on the invalidity of the point of some cultures that women should be regarded as second-class human beings. Yeah, I mean, the thing is, Sam Harris, what's good in him is said by other people. So, I don't see a hell of a lot there that's worth spending time on. Could be wrong, but that's quite often the case, that you can get the same mileage out of other thinkers who aren't quite so, don't have quite a cult around them of people saying, oh, they're so wonderful, so great, The reduction of the suffering of conscious beings, yeah, I mean, what's wrong with that? Nothing, as far as I can see. All right, Charles Baudelaire. If AI, I'll just scrolled up a bit. Here we go. Where was that? If AI should really reach human level and we might have android soldiers, what might it mean for warfare and the ethics of warfare? Any thoughts? Well, yeah, we'd better hope that the AI was developed by people who put in ethical safeguards, because I sure don't think that some AI that is, highly developed is going to figure those things out on its own. And man, talking to a lot of the people that I see in the tech sector, I'm not super optimistic about what they're going to turn out, because quite often they seem, they think that ethics is way simpler than it is, and they talk that way. And yeah, and this is a live issue, not just with AI and warfare. I mean, think about, once we actually have coordinated driverless cars all over the place, including driverless trucks, We better hope that there's been a lot of thought put into how that's going to work, and probably that won't be the case. Probably it's going to be reacting to things as they happen, and then trying to fix it on the fly. Yeah. Neem007. Do you think social media websites need to be considered as public utilities? That's a good question. I think that at this point, they're becoming so. It probably depends. We probably have to look at this case by case. You know, right now we're treating them as if they're all just public companies. You know, but we have to ask, what are the goods? And we probably need to think about that in terms of internet access as well. All right. But that's a big question. So I'm going to put that one off, because actually I've got to get off of here in less than 15 minutes, and I have a lot of other questions to get to. I have to go over to Milwaukee Institute of Art and Design and teach about Aristotle tonight. All right. Wow. J to B to Nick. What would Christ say about the modern political situation? I think he'd be pretty unhappy on the large part. I mean, I think he'd be happy about the fact that we do have participatory democracies in a lot of places. I'm not saying that, you can look at the Gospels and see, hey, democracy is good or something like that. But if you think about the sort of involvement of the human person and, capacity for agency, I think that's important. But man, it's pretty messed up all over the place. The good news about having sort of a historical view is you realize it's never been particularly good as far as political situation goes, but then it's always been particularly bad. So it's kind of bad news too. TK, I would at one point have said civilians should never be the deliberate target of warfare, but psychological warfare, especially with regard to information warfare, primarily targets civilians now. He follows up by saying people watch RT News, don't realize it's an apparatus of the Russian information's warfare plan. Yeah, I mean, that is targeting civilians. All the stuff with targeting civilians in terms of voting is doing that as well. Should we say that that's bad? Yeah, I think it is. You're certainly, and with social media, it's particularly insidious, right? Because you're just putting the stuff out there and you're affecting the information landscape in such a way as to make it difficult to get good, reliable access to good information without so much disinformation. That said, so are many of the big, lobbying organizations as well. They're engaging in misinformation all the time. Every time they run a political ad, it's almost always, 3/4 misinformation. Very few political ads that are not, pretty much just rhetoric. But yeah. All right. Molly Boy, do I think the world would be a better place if we didn't have countries or religion? Maybe in the distant future, the world will be like that. Or do you think the loss of tradition, patriotism is a bad thing? I guess the question that you have to ask to answer that is, well, what's going to be in place of countries? The religion thing, let's put to the side for the time being. But if we don't have countries, what is going to organize and structure and rule society? Corporations? Is that going to be better, than countries? Or do we think that somehow like some anarchist solution is going to be the case? We're just going to like form cooperatives and that's going to be how things work. It really depends on who else is going to be in charge then. We don't have countries. Religion, I don't think religion is ever going to go away, quite frankly. There's always going to be some people, and there's always going to be like some people, genuinely pursuing the divine in religion, reading through the wisdom of the past and trying to come to terms with it and dealing with the fact that it often makes their existence much more complicated than simple. And there's always going to be people using religion for, just psychological, needs on their part, or having power over other people, or even, man, I even know some religious people who are just know-it-alls, and they could just as easily have been know-it-alls about something else, but they happen to have picked religion, and they're insufferable. I think those are always going to be with us. But would it be better if we just eliminated religion altogether? I mean, imagine a future in which you're so distanced from religion that looking at religious texts, they became essentially indecipherable. You couldn't figure out what these people were possibly talking about, right? I mean, some people reading theology from the past might say, that's the current situation. I can't figure out what the hell these Trinitarian debates are about or anything like that. But would you be missing something in being that cut off from what's mattered to other human beings for a long time, or not? It's a good question. All right, Jed, how do you feel about William James' Alternative to War essay? Been a long time since I've read it, and I'm kind of fuzzy about what it was asserting, so I can't really say. Ian Laws, or maybe it's Lon Laws. If philosophy as a career hadn't worked out for you, what do you think you'd be doing now for your living? I don't know. Good question. I don't know. Maybe I'd be working in an office somewhere. Probably I'd be doing something with education or communication. I'm pretty good at those sorts of things, and I'm kind of drawn to them. Maybe I'd be working in HR somewhere, or management or something like that. My mom wanted me to be a lawyer, and she even offered to pay for me to go to law school, but I didn't take her up on that because I didn't want to do that at the time. But I could see being a lawyer, although I don't know if I would have been happy doing that. I'm happier being a philosopher. Lane, would the U.S. government's acceptance of drone strikes, bombing, related collateral damage imply the valuation of the lives of U.S. citizens over those of, say, Iraqis? Yeah, definitely. I think when it comes down to it, we, not just the government, but also many of the American people, are cool with things to happen to other people that we would say are a travesty if they happen to Americans. We're not the only people to be in that point of view, but that is a prevalent thing. I remember during the first Iraq war, which I was against, very much in the minority then, right? First it was, listen, we should not be, getting involved in this just to secure these oil fields. And there's going to be a lot of U.S. casualties, and I think that's a terrible thing. And remember, I was just shortly out of the military myself at the time. And then, when I saw how the war was being conducted, and people were like, "Oh, this is so amazing! We have only like 100 so American casualties," and I was looking at, like the estimated Iraqi casualties. I felt sick about that. Again, poor little bastards, conscripted, put out there in the desert to get bombed into nothingness by our superior Air Force. That, most Americans that I talked to, they were like, well, I guess they had it coming, or that kind of sucks for them, but too bad. I mean, American lives are not worth more than other people's lives from a moral perspective. That's all there is to it, All right. Let's see here. Proof Architect, what do you think of Bertrand Russell's inconsistent views that some wars in the 21st century were just, others were unjust? Well, inconsistent in the sense that he's not saying all wars are unjust, right? I mean, if he has criteria that he's applying across the board, he's not inconsistent. I think some wars are just and some wars are unjust, you know? Let's see. John Wolfe, do you know any times Kant speaks about animals? Yeah, he talks about the difference between human beings and animals in a variety of places. I think, one of the places to look is anthropology from a pragmatic point of view. But that's mostly about people, though. Daniel Cox, do I think a phenomenology of the mind or spirit, it's Hegel, right, points towards God? Well, it certainly does in Hegel's text, right, because religion is the last section before absolute knowing. So, yeah, that's his view. Proof architect, here's a good one. What are my thoughts on vigilante justice? Think Batman. Does the status of being a supposed public moral icon justify torture or enhanced interrogation? So we're talking about non-state actors engaging in, violence or torture for the sake of the greater good or to prevent terrible evil from happening. Somebody pointed out, the other day that with Bruce Wayne's resources, he decides to spend them on a bat cave and bat, mobile and batarangs and all that sort of stuff. And he does do some social benefit stuff, right? He's a philanthropist, but couldn't he have done a bit more with, I don't know, improving the police force or something like that? So vigilante justice. Why does vigilante justice occur? It's usually because of a failure of the state, right? And we could ask also about militias as another example. People turn to that sort of thing when there's a sense that there's not going to be justice or protection or security meted out by the state, whether it be because of impotence or corruption or favoritism or things along those lines. Can that sort of thing be justified? Yeah, in some cases it can. In most cases it can't, because it represents a further breakdown of order. And unless it's serving some really good purposes, unless it's really sorely needed, it's probably going to be making things worse. It leads to a factionalization that breaks down society further. All right, so I am going to have to take off. I know there's a lot of other questions and comments here I'm not getting to, but I got to get to my office hours, which technically are supposed to begin in 2 minutes, and I've got about 10 blocks to walk, and I got to get dressed and get into the proper mindset before I go teach these art and design students about Aristotle and his views on happiness and friendship. So thanks for all of the questions and comments. We'll do this again on Facebook later on this month with Facebook Live. I always do one on YouTube and one on Facebook. And I'll see you in the ether somewhere at one of these other online events.